There are two ways we can tell Spring about objects it should manage for us. One way is using annotations, and that's what we're going to cover in this lesson. There is another way using code, which we'll look at later in this section. So back to our main method. Look, here we need to get a bean of type order service. So we want Spring to manage objects of type order service. To do that, we go to our order service class and annotate this with an annotation called component. This is defined in org.springframework.stereotype. So let's press enter. So this is imported on the top. Okay. So with the component annotation, we tell Spring to manage objects of type order service. Now, component is a general purpose annotation. We have other specialized annotations like service for classes that contain business logic. We have repository for classes that interact with a database. We have another annotation that you have seen before, and that's controller. This is used for marking classes as controllers for handling web requests. So back to our code, order service is a service class. So here we can also use the service annotation. Now, technically, service is just an alias for the component, so there is really no difference between the two. Let me show you what I mean. So hold down Command on Mac or Control on Windows and click Service. Look at the implementation. Look, service is an alias for component. So we can use either of these annotations, but the component annotation is often used for utility classes. We use service for classes that contain business logic. Now, look down here. We have an error saying could not auto-wire. No beans of payment service type found. What this error is saying is that order service needs a payment service, but payment service is an interface. So Spring doesn't know how to create instances of the payment service interface. To solve this problem, we have to go to the PayPal payment service class and annotate this with either component or service. Now, technically, we should do the same with the Stripe payment service, but don't do that in this lesson because that's going to cause an issue that we'll talk about later in this section. Okay? So we simply annotated two classes with service. Now, if we run our application, we can see that PayPal was used to process $10. Beautiful. Now, there is another annotation you need to be familiar with, and that is auto-wired. Let's go back to our order service class. So here we have a constructor that takes a payment service. Now, in the past, we had to annotate this constructor with auto-wired to tell Spring to auto-wire this object with its dependencies. But going forward, this is not necessary if our class has a single constructor. So in this case, we can comment this out and everything works, but you might see the auto-wired annotation in a lot of older code bases. Now, if you have multiple constructors here, we have to use auto-wired. Let me show you this in action. So I'm going to temporarily comment this out. Now let's create a default constructor, order service. Now, if we run our application crashes with a null pointer exception because in this example, Spring prefers to use the default constructor with no arguments, and as a result, payment service will remain uninitialized. To solve this problem, we have to bring back the auto-wired annotation. Now, when we run our application, everything works as expected because we have told Spring to auto-wire this class with its dependencies. Okay? Now, what if we have another constructor, but not a default constructor? So let's add payment service here and give it a second parameter like int x. It doesn't really matter. Now, look what happens if we remove the auto-wired annotation. Right away, we can see an error here saying class doesn't contain matching constructor for auto-wiring. But let's run the application and see the error we get because that's a very common error in Spring applications. So let's run this one more time. All right, now we got an exception of type bean creation exception. And the message is error creating bean with the name order service. This is a very common exception. So to solve this issue, again, we have to bring auto-wired back. So Spring auto-wires this class with its dependencies. Let's run our application one more time. Problem is solved. So let's remove this other constructor as well as the auto-wired annotation and move on to the next lesson.